Warning! Do not watch this channel now. Handle the truth. Always pursuing truth brings you topics and truth for you to view, peruse, and pursue. Are you ready? Can you handle the truth?
Also mentioned in here an encounter with Saddam Hussein in Iraq, in Baghdad. Was there anything in that meeting some 20 years ago that would have led you to believe that he'd be playing the role he is today?
I don't think so, but in the light of what's happened, it certainly makes it all the more interesting. I did it actually at the request of Henry Kissinger, who was then Secretary of State. I was going anyway to that part of the world, and Chase had business with the leading commercial bank in Iraq, and so I was going for that. And he asked me if I would also go to see him to say that he would like to establish closer touch with the regime. He felt that it was important that our two countries communicated more effectively. I did see him, and he was pretty cold, and he said the only way we could hope to establish closer relations would be if we would discontinue our support for Israel. Well, it was not likely that that was going to happen.
Right.
So it was not a terribly productive meeting, although in the hindsight it was certainly an interesting one.
A special televised meeting of the New York-based Council on Foreign Relations provides a window to the real story. The speaker, Vice President Dick Cheney, takes a question from David Rockefeller.
Vice President, I just enjoyed so much your whole speech, but I was particularly pleased that you gave such a strong endorsement for the free trade agreement for all the Americas, subject that has been of great concern to me for many years, and particularly recently, and I think it's absolutely essential for the strength of our economy.
Rockefeller's role in the drive for an FTAA was a lot more central than he portrays. Rockefeller cultivated Latin American leaders who could be counted on to support such a proposal. Both the 1994 Miami Summit and the FTAA proposal were conceived and nurtured by a Rockefeller-created network. Prominent among the organizations sponsoring the Miami event were the Council of the Americas, founder and honorary chairman David Rockefeller, the Americas Society, chairman David Rockefeller, the Forum of the Americas, founder David Rockefeller, the Institute for International Economics, financial backer and board member David Rockefeller, the Trilateral Commission, founder and honorary chairman David Rockefeller. Rockefeller's influence also extends to the current administration. He was chairman emeritus of the CFR when Vice President Dick Cheney once served as a director, a relationship that Cheney concealed during his congressional career.
I mean, to me, I see people like Bill O'Reilly on television, right? And I see how much they control the media. Like there's this girl on Bill O'Reilly the other night from an organization saying the world can't wait. And this girl was spot on. Everything she was saying was the truth. And all Bill O'Reilly could do was call her a lunatic. He couldn't challenge the facts. They just call people names. They can't, and until we just find that, look, this world, we're heading into a world of danger, possible nuclear wars, you know, because the banking industry is trying to take over the world. 9/11 is the beginning of the war on terror. That war on terror is leading us into Iraq, which is the next lie. So you had the lie of 9/11, how that happened. Nobody knows how Building 7 came down. Okay, we know 9/11 was a fraud. The American people don't know it, but more and more of them are believing it. Okay? So that was the first lie. Besides the inception, I'm not going back to the inception of the Federal Reserve, that original lie. But 9/11 was the first lie in this present state we're in. 9/11 is the kickoff of the war against the American people and the people of the world. 9/11 was a phony. It's a fraud. It didn't happen the way they told us it happened. Now, because of 9/11, we then had the authority to go into Afghanistan and Iraq. Iraq didn't have weapons of mass destruction. Okay? So that was the next lie. Now they're talking about going into Iran. Now, how would you feel if you were Iran and you had this big, powerful country, America, go into your next-door neighbor, take over their oil fields, right? Wouldn't you be worried that what they were going to do to you? Of course you're going to be worried. But the people of America don't think about it from Iran's point of view. They think about it from our point of view. So now we're going to send more troops into Iraq and keep building up because they want Iraq and the Middle East to become part of the New World Order.
Aaron and I are standing here on the floor now with former Secretary of State Henry Kissinger, who was here ringing the bell commemorating 30 years of U.S.-China relations, which, of course, were made possible by the hard work that Secretary Kissinger did while serving under President Nixon. And we welcome you, sir. Thank you very much for being with us.
Good to be here.
The obvious first question is the situation in Gaza. It's an area of the world you have worked very hard on. What is your view? How serious is this?
We have to remember, Israel withdrew from Gaza unconditionally in 2005. And they are reacting to rocket attacks that have been launched out of Gaza. So the problem is, can those rocket attacks be stopped? And then they will have to stop their military operation. It's a complicated situation, but it's one that I believe will be solved, because if peace is to evolve in the Middle East, Israel has to take its responsibilities, but the moderate Arab nations have to take responsibility for the conduct of Israel's neighbors.
Do you believe that this is, some people say that everything will stop a few days before the Obama inauguration, that this is all very politically motivated? Do you think that's true?
I think it's a continuing process. The fundamental problem is, can Gaza conduct itself in a way that it is not a military threat to Israel? Then there will have to be a negotiation eventually, and soon, between Israel and the Palestinians about an overall peace settlement.
What do you think the most important thing is for Barack Obama? Obviously, you're here to talk about the anniversary for U.S.-China diplomatic relations, but if you had to say this is going to be the country or the conflict or the place that will define the Obama administration, what would it be?
The president-elect is coming into office at a moment when there are upheavals in many parts of the world simultaneously. You have India, Pakistan, you have the jihadist movement. So he can't really say there is one problem that is the most important one. But he can give a new impetus to American foreign policy, partly because the reception of him is so extraordinary around the world. I think his task will be to develop an overall strategy for America in this period when really a new world order can be created. It's a great opportunity. It isn't just a crisis.
Are you confident about the people President-elect Obama has chosen to surround him? Because he does not have a great deal of experience.
No, he has appointed an extraordinarily able group of people in both the international and financial field.
Mr. Secretary, we thank you very much.
It doesn't look much like a bank, but today Downing Street and so we the taxpayers have become the biggest shareholders in these high street names. It's also a huge investment in the country's future. The banks may have been saved, but the Prime Minister was keen to insist it's not free money.
The action we are taking is unprecedented, but essential for all of us. It is not just important to economists and financial experts, it's something that matters for every family and business in Britain. In extraordinary times, with financial markets ceasing to work, the government cannot just leave people on their own to be buffeted about. For savers, for small businesses and for homeowners, we must, in an uncertain and unstable world, be the rock of stability upon which British people can depend.
To bolster confidence in the banking system, the government forced the banks to drastically increase their reserves by buying shares in them using taxpayers' money. It's made £37 billion available to 3 of the country's biggest banks. RBS will need 20 billion of that, twice its stock market value, giving the taxpayer a 63% share. The government is not expected to buy shares in Lloyd's TSB until after its merger with HBOS, and then it will get £17 billion from the nation, giving the taxpayer a 41% stake of the newly merged bank. David Cameron had misgivings, but was forced to support the government's move.
This is necessary but painful. It needs to be done, but it's expensive. And in some ways, it's paying the bills for the last 10 years of excessive debt.
Here in the city, the news of the bailout plan got initial approval. The market rose, the screens covered in blue for buy signs compared to last week's sell-off. But the real question is, how long will it last?
It's pretty obvious that there's some gigantic financial institutions that have been pulling the strings of politicians in this country for a long time. And just the fact that we have it set up where they can donate millions of dollars to these guys' funds, these guys' campaigns. I mean, how do we not expect it all to go bad?
Following on from its court defeats last year over unfair bank charges, the Office of Fair Trading intends to gloss over the matter of overdraft charges altogether in an upcoming report. Due next month, the report is expected to be highly critical of payday loans, pawnbroking and other high-cost forms of credit. But the Daily Mail claims that bank charges will be barely touched upon. In November, the Supreme Court ruled that the OFT had no power to rule on complaints about banks and overdraft charges. British Cheque and Credit Association condemned the omission, arguing that overdrafts that incur charges are just another form of short-term credit, and yet they're escaping scrutiny. Unlike other kinds of credit which have to advertise the annual percentage rate of interest charged, bank overdrafts are allowed to be publicised with an equivalent annual rate which excludes charges. Eurodebt's director Vance Parsons says whilst high-cost forms of credit are a major concern for us with vulnerable clients who get into a debt spiral, we also look at the fees incurred through bank charges. We offer a prepaid current account for just this purpose with a flat monthly fee of £12.50 and no additional charges for failed payments. Transferring direct debits and standing orders is really easy and there are no credit checks.
Singer Billy Bragg is threatening to withhold tax payments in protest at bank bonuses. The folk singer and activist has set up a Facebook page urging people to sign up to his campaign. RBS, which is 84% owned by the taxpayer, is set to pay its investment bankers as much as £1.5 billion in bonuses. Billy joins us now. You're angry about this, aren't you?
I am very angry, and in some ways it follows on from what Vince was saying, you know, that process of changing the focus of our economy away from the financial sector. We're trying to kickstart that process by drawing a line in the sand over these RBS bonuses.
And you're saying to people, don't pay your taxes?
Well,
which might incur them in a fine.
I am prepared not to pay my tax. I mean, most people watching this programme will be PAYE anyway. It's not a matter for those. But I'm prepared to withhold my tax on Sunday, and if people would like to support me.
Dealing with banks can drive you crazy, and here with 5 things that could tap into your nest egg is our financial contributor, Vera Gibbons. Big transition here from the Emmys
Yeah, right.
to real life stuff, right? From
exactly
fantasy
right.
to reality.
Reality.
Okay, let's talk about some of these different things that really drive us nuts. And one of the things that seems to be difficult to get a handle on are the fees.
Well, here's the thing, Harry. I mean, banks made $1.4 trillion in bad loans. So in efforts to shore up the balance sheet, they are slapping on more and more fees. Fees now account for 53% of a bank's income. That's up from 35% in 1995. So you've got all these nasty fees. Overdraft fees, of course, the big one. $40 billion in overdraft fees. And the average overdraft fee is $35.
Man, so you write that check. I mean, you have to be so careful about what you put in your account, what you take out of your account,
Well,
how you
part of the
transfer your
problem, too, is,
funds.
though, that they clear the largest ones first, so your rent, your mortgage, and then they work their way down to the smaller ones, so that $3 cup of coffee could conceivably cost you, nearly $40.
Right, a couple of $20 checks could cost
Exactly.
you hundreds
It adds up.
after a little while. Okay, one of the other things you say you have to really be careful of is lack of disclosure.
Well, the banks are required by law to disclose fees, interest rates to potential customers, but the General Accountability Office actually took a look at this, looked at 185 branches, and found that many are not complying with the law.
Lord Phillips, then the president of the Supreme Court, ruling in favour of the banks. 7 banks in the Nationwide Building Society had gone to the Supreme Court to try and stop the Office of Fair Trading investigating the fairness of their charges for unauthorised overdrafts, and they have won that appeal, overturning a decision by the High Court and the Court of Appeal. So the banks have won at the Supreme Court today. What's this going to mean? Let's speak now to lawyer Daniel Barnett, who can talk us through the legal implications of that ruling. What happens now, Mr. Barnett?
Well, it's an absolutely shocking judgment for the Office of Fair Trading and for the many tens of thousands of consumers who've been relying on the House of Lords, or the Supreme Court as it's called now, to say that bank charges for unauthorised overdrafts are potentially illegal. What the Supreme Court has done is cut that attempt to limit bank charges short, and banks are now free to charge, with one exception, as much as they want for unauthorised overdraft charges.
And what happens to those cases, some million cases that have been frozen while these proceedings have been going on? What happens to those bank customers who've got cases frozen at the moment?
It depends on how those bank customers have brought those cases. There are 2 ways of bringing a case against the bank challenging charges. The first is relying on the Office of Fair Trading challenge, saying that the overdraft charges are unreasonable and unfair. Anyone who was relying on that and who was piggybacking on the back of this Supreme Court litigation has now had the carpet pulled from under their feet, and they're going to have their claims dismissed. Possibly in the larger value cases, they're going to have to pay some of the bank's costs. The other means of attacking the bank's charges, which hasn't yet been closed down and in fact is considered by many to be a fairly decent argument, is not what today's case was about, but is arguing that the bank charges amount to what's called a penalty, which is saying that they don't reflect a fair pre-estimate of the loss that a bank will incur when a client breaches its contract with a bank. The way the argument goes is that the clients, the consumers, say, I had a contract with the bank that I can go into overdraft to up to, say, £1,000, but I went over that to £1,500, and the bank has slapped a £35 charge on me for exceeding an agreed overdraft limit. The argument goes that that £35 charge, or whatever it may be from the different banks, is a penalty because it doesn't accurately reflect the value of the cost to the bank of allowing or considering whether someone should be allowed to exceed their overdraft limit. But what it means is that every single consumer now is going to have to bring an individual case against the banks. They cannot rely on the Office of Fair Trading succeeding in this mass litigation on their behalf.
I think, talking about the actual cost, the campaigners say that it actually cost the banks somewhere in the region of £2.50 for them to go over their authorised overdraft facility, that charge of £35. Those who've got claims going through the courts, those who are hoping that they might be able to recoup some money from this, will be very disappointed, won't they, Mr. Barnett? But, on the other hand, we've been having a lot of emails from bank customers who say, actually, I bank very responsibly. I've never gone over my overdraft limit. And if this, the OFT, if the Supreme Supreme Court had ruled in favour of the OFT, then the banks were saying, well, actually, we'll have to start charging for bank accounts. So there will be some who'll be relieved by this decision, won't there?
Yeah, it's a very, very good point. The banks have to make their profit somehow, otherwise there's no point in them carrying on their normal activities. And if they can't make their profits in part through overdraft charges and similar charges, they're going to have to start introducing, as we've heard, charges for ordinary consumers to engage in current account banking.
And we heard Lord Phillips there summing up their decision. Can you just remind us the grounds on which they said they'd made that decision?
Yes, they were overturning the decision of 4 previous judges, the High Court judge and then 3 judges in the Court of Appeal. And those judges had said that the Office of Fair Trading was allowed to investigate the fairness of overdraft charges because it was a stand-determined condition and wasn't anything to do with the adequacy, this is the legal phrase, the adequacy of the price or remuneration as against the goods or the services supplied. Putting that into English, the OFT is only allowed to challenge terms if it's got nothing to do with the value of the goods or services received, the price paid for them. The Court of Appeal said, well, bank charges aren't part of the goods or services received and the bank charge isn't anything to do with the price. The House of Lords, the Supreme Court, has disagreed and said that the overdraft charges are so tied up with the remuneration that banks charge for their services that you can't strip them out, and therefore the Office of Fair Trading is not allowed to investigate the fairness of those fees.
Some of them may have been bailed out by the taxpayer, but Britain's biggest banks aren't letting them stop them giving their employees what's called bumper bonuses. It's a decision in defiance of political and public pressure to curb the payouts amid the severe cuts being made elsewhere all across the economy. RT's Laura Emmett asks London's neediest what they think.
This is austerity Britain. The homeless and needy queue up for food handouts from charities all over London and the UK. But just a few miles away, it's a different world with different rules. Prime Minister David Cameron has shied away from regulating bankers' bonuses. They might have to be a bit more open about them, but pay won't be curbed and there will be no windfall tax.
There was a period of remorse and apology for banks. I think that period needs to be over.
And bankers have taken that to heart. UK banks, including some of those bailed out by taxpayers last year, will be paying out $11 billion to their staff this year. Here on the street, where the needy live literally from hand to mouth, that's going down badly.
Well, I think that's a disgrace. I think they should do something they did in America, and that is we bail you out, you start paying bonuses. But according to the British law, they can't do that, because they still have their bonuses, so I disagree totally with that.
And he's not the only one complaining. Last year saw thousands of students out on the streets demonstrating against austerity cuts brought about by a global crisis triggered by reckless bankers. Now the Right to Work campaign is calling for a fresh wave of protests against what they're dubbing the government's surrender to the bankers and their huge paychecks.
Well, basically, I think that the amount of bankers' bonuses is obscene, especially when there are people struggling to even pay their rent, to even feed and clothe their children, and when people are getting £3 million bonuses that are quite frankly excessive and just a disgusting amount of money.
Taxpayer lobby groups say they don't care what privately owned banks do, but the ones that have been bailed out with taxpayer money have to show some restraint.
We can't possibly be expected to stomach, at a time when the government's making spending cuts, to stomach these enormous bonus payouts and to watch all this go on when these banks seem to forget that it was the public's money that saved them.
But not everyone sees it that way. Daniel Hoffman from Zurich Financial Services says banks are still vital in supporting economic recovery, and if bonuses aren't paid, the best bankers will move elsewhere.
It's very crucial that the banking sectors around the world, mainly in the advanced economies, are getting healthier and can support economic growth.
But out on the street, those who depend on charity to put food in their mouths find that difficult to stomach.
With this latest backtracking on bonus regulation, it seems banks and the government have learnt very little from the financial crisis. Just a few miles away, bankers continue to fill their pockets and look set to be able to go on unabated. But this time they're doing it with taxpayer money, which could have been used to help the needy. Laura Emmett, RT, London.
You have millions of college grads who haven't entered the workforce yet, that haven't been able to get jobs out of college, and they have degrees in worthlessness, and they're $25,000 on average in debt. So a college education, what kind of job does that even buy you? What do? You have first choice at getting, being a shelf stocker at Walmart's at 3 in the morning. So no, the jobs aren't being, the gap between the rich and the poor in the U.S. is the widest of any of the industrialized nations. Wages are stagnant. Median household income is below 2000 levels. It's only a small segment of the top that has all the cream. When you talk about those bonuses, $144 billion, those handful of Wall Streeters are the equivalent to a country that would rank 49th out of 134 countries in the world. We've said it since 2008 when the TARP programs began. It happened in front of everyone's eyes. Wall Street has hijacked Washington. It's the greatest bank robbery in world history, and the banks are doing the robbing. You have costs that are off the books in the trillions of dollars that cities aren't going to be able to meet in terms of benefits and retirements and health care. You're going to see a bust happen in the United States and cities that's going to rival what's going on in Ireland, what's going to happen in Portugal, what's happened in Greece. It's going worldwide. The American empire is unfolding and collapsing in front of everyone's eyes. The only way out is to bring jobs back in, and the thing that you can never talk about, cut the military budget, bring the troops home, cut the bases, shut down the bases, end the wars, and stop spending trillions overseas that you could be rebuilding this country. But the politicians are in the pocket of the military-industrial complex and Wall Street. Wall Street has hijacked Washington. Only a child can't see the proof, or the ignorant, or the people that are getting paid off. All you have to do is look at the facts and add up the numbers.
No charges for cards abroad. What are you doing? Sorry? Why don't you charge people for using the cards abroad? Well, because we don't. Oh, we're in the same game, you and me, hey? We tell them it's like a tip. It's like a tip. A tip? Yeah, well, you tip people on holiday, don't you? How are you going to kid out your staff room without tips? We don't take tips. Oh, you want to say our staff room? It's like a billionaire playboy's yacht, only without the...
At Nationwide, we don't charge for using your cards abroad. Maybe that's why over 6 million people have their current account or credit cards with us.
Well, well, well. Wasn't that quite a little show? Ladies and gentlemen, just facts now, no opinion. These are the facts about what you were just witnessing. This body is up there screaming about what? They're screaming about bonuses that AIG paid to employees, right? Why are they screaming about this? They could have stopped this. They made this happen. The Congress and the White House made this happen. Indulge me while I read to you, please. Quote, during late night, closed-door talks last month, negotiators for the United States House of Representatives, the United States Senate, and the White House of the United States stripped a measure from the stimulus bill that would have restricted these AIG bonuses. They had a measure in the bill that would have restricted the bonuses, and they took it out before it became law. Instead, a measure by Senator Chris Dodd, Democrat of Connecticut, to limit executive compensation replaced it. But Dodd's measure explicitly exempted bonuses agreed to prior to the passage of the stimulus bill. Congress, you cannot have it both ways. You cannot first say, we're not going to make you limit the bonuses, and now say, limit the bonuses. This is the same Congress, or the same body at least, that in 1994 put in place the Community Redevelopment Act, which made it so that more and more Americans would own homes, whether they could afford them or not. In 1998, Glass-Steagall was taken out. Glass-Steagall is the thing that made a separation between commercial banks and investment banks and put them all under the same rules. By 2003, 2004, the investment banks were getting their clocks cleaned by the commercial banks because they're all working under the same rules. So in 2004, they made a change. And they said, we're going to change the amount of leverage that's necessary. In other words, you will be required to have less money to lend more money. Leveraged, over-leveraged. And by 2004, when that happened, these investment banks agreed to have in their offices regulators from the Securities and Exchange Commission. Had to have them right in their office. You know when Bear Stearns got an SEC regulator in its office? 3.5 years later, the first regulator came into its office because its hedge fund had collapsed. And now the Congress of the United States, which has allowed all of this, is grandstanding to beat the band. Are you kidding me? Chris Dodd's measure made this happen. It's a fact. And Barney Frank's up there asking to name names of the people who got the bonuses. These people signed a contract with a company. The contract says, if I perform the following services, I will receive the following compensation. It is a fundamental bedrock of the Constitution of the United States that contracts are to be respected. Had this Congress not changed the rules, had Chris Dodd's amendment not changed to the stimulus bill not been in there, this would not have happened. The Congress did this. And furthermore, Barney Frank asking the CEOs to name names. Remember Joe McCarthy? He asked people to name names in that body too, and nobody liked it. What's going on in Washington? We're going to get to the bottom of it in 2 minutes. That CEO, Liddy, was not there. He got there 6 months ago. He was brought in to try to clean this mess up. It was this Congress that said to that company, go ahead with your bonuses. It was Chris Dodd of Connecticut's new stipulation that allowed this, explicitly said this is the way for it to be done. And now they're up there putting on a show for us, trying to make us forget that the banking crisis is real and a day of judgment is coming, and we are all going to pay. When you go to a restaurant at night and it's only 1/4 full, you're like, wow, they're hurting, but it's open. It's not going to stay open. This is getting worse, and they're distracting us, and we are not going to let them do it. This is their...
I mean, the economy is going to crash. That's why I wrote that book. The problem is the bailout ultimately is going to make the problem worse. The politicians have to, resist the temptation to do something because they've already done enough damage. And we have to remember, they caused this crisis. It was the most irresponsible monetary policy in U.S. history, together with the moral hazards of Freddie and Fannie, that allowed American citizens to borrow trillions of dollars and spend every penny. Now we can't pay the money back, and so the institutions that loaned all the money are naturally going broke. But we have to let the market function. We have to purge these malinvestments from our economy. If that means a lot of failures, a lot of bankruptcies, so be it. If the government tries to artificially prop it up, we're going to create a much bigger crisis down the line because they're going to destroy the value of our currency. And then we're going to have a real economic crisis that's going to make this look like a Sunday school picnic.
But Peter, what the government is saying, what Democrats and Republicans in Congress are saying, that if the government doesn't bail out these companies, the scale of this meltdown will be such that it will reverberate around the world. But there is no way, because the credit markets are frozen and the economy is going to come to a standstill.
Well, they're frozen because we've blown all the money on consumption. It's gone. The government doesn't have any money to solve the crisis. They can't bail anybody out. All they have is a printing press. So all we're going to do is take the losses off the books of the banks and stick them on the books of the federal government. But that's not going to change the fact that we've lost all this money. And it's not going to restore credit flowing. We can't borrow anymore. Americans can't borrow to buy cars anymore because we're broke.
You're the one guy who has had this right from the very beginning. But the problem is, if you say stuff like this, it sounds like a conspiracy theory. And I can't get, I mean, there's nobody in the media that is reporting this. There's nobody that's talking about this stuff, but it only makes common sense. If people know that the end is coming of the system that we have, and I'm not saying that, I'm not saying that we're all going to, cats and dogs are going to be sleeping with each other, et cetera, et cetera. What I'm saying is, there's going to be a change coming. Rupert Murdoch said that nations will be redefined in this period. You know that people at the global level are looking at it and saying, okay, what's it going to look like? Where can we find out? Where do we start to look?
Well, you should look to the Congress, but they don't pay much attention either. And there will be a realignment, and there's a struggle going on with us who believe that we should have national sovereignty. We should be out of the UN, out of the World Bank, out of the IMF, and no world government. But that is the movement that we're going in. That is the direction that we're going in. But others are planning to go one step further. They weren't satisfied with Bretton Woods. They weren't satisfied with the dollar standard. Now they want to probably modify the special drawing rights of the IMF, which they tried and didn't fail. But they want to control capital, and they want to control the natural resources of the world. So, and they're not nationalistic at all. They believe in world government, and they're more out in the open now than they were 25 years ago.
Here's the problem. I mean, everybody will say, "Oh, that Glenn Beck, he's a conservative. He just loved the Bush administration." No, I didn't. And while I am a businessman myself and I like big business, I don't have a problem with Walmart. I do have a problem with people that look at our country as a market. And that's what's happening. These global corporations are just looking at people as consumers and a market, so they don't give a flying crap about our Constitution or anything else. What's good for business? How do you stop that?
I think there's a lot of truth to that, but I concentrate on making sure nobody is big because they get a special benefit, either the bankers or the corporations, the international corporations, because inevitably they get benefits. They get tax subsidies of all sorts, they get contracts, and they are protected, and they get all kinds of benefits from government. When you're big for that reason, let's argue that Walmart got big because they satisfied the consumer. We don't want to come down hard on bigness per se. Bigness in capitalism is good as long as they got there by the consumer voting confidence in that particular business.
Yeah. Congressman, thank you very much. By the way, America, I mean, I hope I'm nuts. I mean, really, you've never met anybody who hopes he's wrong more than I am, or I do. The solutions are going to be presented as gigantic and global. And the answer is going to be local. The answer is going to come from you and your local community and your state, not the globe. That's where a nightmare is coming. The question is, do we have a shadow government? And if we do, who are those intelligent minority that is guiding us through? And where are they guiding us to? If you skip past all of the puppets and the strings, if you stop looking at the puppets themselves, you have to see who's behind the puppets. Who is choosing the puppets and the players? Who's the puppet master? George Soros.
So, George, Glenn Beck has been on this kick that you are actually the mastermind who is trying to bring down the American government. How do you react when you see this kind of thing?
Well, I would be amused if people saw the joke in it, because what he is doing, he is projecting what Rupert Murdoch is doing, because he has a media empire that is telling the people some falsehoods and leading the government in the wrong direction. But you know, by accusing me of doing that, it kind of makes it rather hard to see that it's really he is working for the man who's doing it, which is Fox News.
But it's very personal. I mean, he talks about you as a 14-year-old boy, and he accuses you of essentially helping to round Jews up. When you're Jewish yourself, you lost many, many people in the Holocaust. How did you feel when you heard that?
Well, look, Fox News makes a habit. It has imported the methods of George Orwell, you know, Newspeak, where you can tell the people falsehoods and deceive them.
He's Citizen Murdoch, the head of the world's biggest private media empire.
Murdoch likes to own newspapers.
Murdoch controls 175 newspapers, book and internet businesses, and some of the most popular and strident TV networks.
You know what I'm doing? Shut up. Shut up about sex. Shut up.
But how healthy is it to concentrate such global power in one man?
It is not defensible as a part of any liberal democracy.
Rupert, is there any agenda that you want to shape?
No, not at all. I mean, I think that We don't have the power to change it. We obviously, if you're in media and you're concerned with what's going on in the world, you'd like to make a difference by putting forward your opinions. But you're not going to change the world completely by that. I think we can't change elections. I think good, strong news organizations can, by disclosing things, can help shape the agenda, but only in a limited way.
For example, take the war. I'm not just talking about the United States, but in terms of you having a global media enterprise, I mean, have you shaped that agenda at all in terms of perceptions of the war, in terms of how the war is viewed?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we've tried.
Tried in what way?
Well, we basically supported our papers and our television. I would say supported the Bush policy in the Middle East. We've been very critical of its execution, but our support hasn't meant very much, because clearly public opinion now has grown very, very tired of the whole enterprise.
Italy is the main victim now of the refugee influx, but now Mediterranean ministers, they're coordinating the EU's response. What do you expect to come out of this meeting?
Well, you know, since the mid-90s, the Europeans have tried to devise a policy for their relations with North Africa that would involve controlling the flow of migrants northwards, usually economic migrants. But of course, there have been also some dissidents, some people fleeing persecution. So this is a long story and just the latest episode in it. Now, as opposed to receiving people trying to flee the regimes in North Africa, we're now seeing supporters of the regimes, the dictatorial regimes, who colluded and cooperated with the Europeans on controlling migration. It is they who now need safe haven in Europe, otherwise they will be victims of revenge inside the countries where they have previously ruled.
So you're saying these migrants, they need safe haven in Europe, but let's talk about how to prevent the ongoing chaos here, because France and Germany, they've threatened Libya with EU sanctions over the bloody crackdown. Do you think there's a more effective way, perhaps a more effective method of ending the bloodshed?
Well, I think you also have some other voices in Europe being raised, including in the United Kingdom, where they're suggesting that actually now is a time to intervene militarily in Libya, not in Tunisia, not in Algeria, and certainly not in Egypt. But in Libya, there is a crucial moment where the Europeans need to be seen to be doing more for the safety of Libyans. And that they should not be talking about sanctions, because those can't be activated quickly and they're not going to have an immediate impact. They can freeze the assets of Gaddafi and family if they want to, but again, he's fighting for his survival, he's fighting to the death, he said so. So something a little bit stronger than sanctions is called for.
Okay, so you're saying the sanctions would be ineffective, but you're also suggesting that European powers should be more open-armed, setting the standard, setting the precedent for incoming migrants here. But let's talk about one of the economic issues, and it must be on the minds of many motorists out there, the oil prices. They continue to climb amid the ongoing unrest. We know that Libya holds most of the oil reserves of Africa. Analysts are saying nearly 1/5 of its productions are already shut down. Just how is this going to hit us in the pocket, do you think?
You know, you say that I was actually advocating a more open-armed policy towards migrants from North Africa. I'm simply saying this is an ongoing story, and the Europeans thus far, even though they're an aging population in Western Europe, even though they're a dwindling population in Western Europe, are not ready to receive more African migrants or Arab migrants.
But you were saying that European powers putting sanctions on Libya would be ineffective. Then what are the options here? Because you were suggesting that European powers set a precedent here.
I'm suggesting that if they want good relations with whatever regime emerges in Libya, they need to be seen to have been on the side of that regime sooner than now. If they look like all they're going to do is sit back and wait for the Libyans to decide, then they are not ahead of the game. Now, in terms of oil contracts, we've seen European countries, the Italians, the French, definitely the British as well as the Americans, working quite hard to get along with the Gaddafi regime in order to have energy contracts in Libya. And Libya is one of the key suppliers of fuel to Western Europe. And in the current circumstances, yes, there's going to be a rapid rise in prices because of the crisis. Long term, a more equitable, a more responsive, a more democratic regime, were it to emerge in Libya, could be very good news for stability long term, and any Libyan will want to sell their oil. But in the near term, there's going to be a crisis and therefore a price spike.
How dare they? President Obama, Democratic leaders have decided to bypass a formal House and Senate conference committee in order to reconcile those two health care bills. Instead, White House and Democratic leaders will hold informal, that's another word for secret, negotiations, meant to shut Republicans and the public out of the process. What a far cry from the election, when then-candidate Obama pledged to, quote, broadcast health care negotiations on C-SPAN so that the American people can see what the choices are, unquote. President Obama hasn't even made a token effort to keep his campaign promises of more openness and transparency in government. It was all just another lie that was told in order to get elected. The head of C-SPAN wrote a letter, asked Congress to, quote, open all the important negotiations, including any conference committee meetings, to electronic media coverage, unquote. When White House Press Secretary Robert Gibbs was asked whether the administration would support televising the negotiations, he refused to answer, instead mumbling something about, I haven't seen the letter. That wasn't the question, Mr. Gibbs. You either support openness or you don't. The Democrats insist this is all on the up and up, with House Speaker Nancy Pelosi saying, quote, there's never been a more open process for any legislation, unquote. Really? This is the same Nancy Pelosi who, you may recall, after becoming Speaker in 2006, promised the Democrats would have, quote, the most honest, most open, and most ethical Congress in history, unquote. Here's hoping the voters remember some of this crap when the midterm elections roll around later this year.
At a 1991 closed-door meeting of fellow internationalists, billionaire and former CFR chairman David Rockefeller praised his media allies. But his confidence that his words would not leave the room was later broken.
We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other publications whose directors have attended our meetings and restricted their promises of discretion for almost 40 years. It would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright lights of publicity. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march toward a world government.
Redirecting the bright lights of publicity is not the media's only contribution towards such a plan.
Have before us the opportunity to forge for ourselves and for future generations a new world order, a world where the rule of law, not the law of the jungle, governs the conduct of nations. When we are successful, and we will be, we have a real chance at this new world order, an order in which a credible United Nations can use its peacekeeping role to fulfill the promise and vision of the UN's founders.
Real Palestinian problem, and he talked to me once about they were playing with the idea of bringing Israel to Arizona, you know, and taking all the people from Israel and giving everybody $1 million and setting up Israel in the state of Arizona.
Unbelievable.
To end that problem, because that's a problem that they're not in charge of, in a sense. They're not controlling that problem. They're very arrogant. They can do whatever they want to do. We've given these people the authority to create money out of thin air, and through that device, they control everything. And if you want to win the battle to stop that, you have to deny them the ability to create money. It's only because they can make money that they have all this power.
They literally have the money machines.
They have the money machines. They can print it. They can do whatever they want to do. They own everything.
Aaron, we take over pretty quick. If we were the guys that issued the money, everybody had to come give us real assets for the use of this money we just printed up.
You know, people. You know, I tell people, you know, why in the world does the American government borrow money from the banks when they have the ability to create it themselves without borrowing it and paying interest on it? Why? And nobody can answer that question. Not one politician ever raises that. Why does the American government borrow money when they can create it without paying interest?
Well, we did create it up until
1913. And so people say, well, because if the American government does it, it'll create inflation. That's the answer. I say, well, let's look at it. The American government has the Federal Reserve do it, which creates the same inflation as if they did it. But also with the inflation, now you're getting massive debt. So with the Federal Reserve, you have inflation and debt. Now, if the American government made the money, backed by gold, which limited the amount they could make, you wouldn't have debt and you wouldn't have inflation.
But inflation was only about 50% from the 1780s, I've looked it up, until the late 1800s. And then we have the central banks already trying to cause some panics, which they then used to push the Federal Reserve. And if we look at inflation since 1913 into 2007, it's exponential. In fact, $1 is worth about 2 pennies what it was worth in 1913. Federal Reserve Chairman, former Federal Reserve Chairman Alan Greenspan, doubled the money supply from 2000 to 2006. And then Edward Bernanke, the new Fed chief, came in and said he was going to double it again in the next 2 years. And then he said, now I'm going to make the money supply numbers secret. And so now we don't even know. Right. But the evidence is they are just, I mean, in the curve of inflation, it gradually grows. And then suddenly at a point, it goes straight up. And it seems we've
it's
now...
parabolic, yeah.
Parabolic.
But the thing is that the only thing I disagree with you on from... early 1800 to 1913, there was no inflation other than during the Civil War. You know, when Lincoln was
well, I'm talking about how much $1 was worth. And I know
it never changed. There was no inflation. In that whole 100 years, there was no inflation. People knew what the money was worth. They could retire. They knew what it would cost them to live their lives out. There was no problem. It was only since 1913, when the Fed came in, that we created massive inflation and massive debt.
So then what you said earlier, then there really wasn't inflation.
There was no inflation.
So you don't get inflation when the government issues the money, at least in the U.S. history.
Well, not if it's backed by gold.
Well, exactly. But I'm talking about, and I did look this up, and I believe that if you look after the country was set up, and some of the things that happened with Andrew Jackson and the rest of it, there were points where it spiked and there were manipulations.
There were points, mostly during the Civil War.
Yeah. And that's because Lincoln printed so much money.
Exactly. That's right. But once that ended, but basically there was no inflation other than that during that short period of time. I mean, a loaf of bread was a loaf, of course, the same thing. People could plan their lives. Today, they plan inflation. Now you have two parents working. They can't afford to pay for their family anymore. The kids are going to state-run schools now. The kids are being indoctrinated how to think. They're being given Ritalin. They're being given all these drugs. The whole country's being dumbed down. It's all because of the Federal Reserve System. And the Federal Reserve System and these bankers are responsible for the demise of America. And if we ever want to win this battle, you must shut down the Federal Reserve System. And we must shut down these bankers and restore sound money to this country.
You talk a little.
And you probably noticed I don't feel about that war the way we were told we were supposed to feel about that war, the way we were ordered and instructed by the United States government to feel about that war. You see, I'll tell you, my mind doesn't work that way. I got this real moron thing I do. It's called thinking. And I'm not a very good American because I like to form my own opinions. I don't just roll over when I'm told to. Sad to say, most Americans just roll over on command. Not me. I have certain rules I live by. My first rule, I don't believe anything the government tells me. Nothing. Take very seriously the media or the press in this country, who in the case of the Persian Gulf War were nothing more than unpaid employees of the Department of Defense, and who most of the time function as kind of an unofficial public relations agency for the United States government. So I don't listen to them. I don't really believe in my country, and I gotta tell you folks, I don't get all choked up about yellow ribbons and American flags. Now, to balance the scale, I'd like to talk about some things that bring us together. Things that point out our similarities instead of our differences. Because that's all you ever hear about in this country is our differences. That's all the media and the politicians are ever talking about, the things that separate us, things that make us different from one another. That's the way the ruling class operates in any society. They try to divide the rest of the people. They keep the lower and the middle classes fighting with each other so that they, the rich, can run off with all the fucking money. Fairly simple thing, happens to work. You know, anything different, that's what they're going to talk about. Race, religion, ethnic and national background, jobs, income, education, social status, sexuality, anything you can do, keep us fighting with each other so that they can keep going to the bank.